Welcome everyone from all around the world. You're joining us from all over the place. We're so delighted you could be here to be part of this event and to join the chatter in Hopin. I see things are already getting lively in there, but we're really delighted to see you here today. My name's Phil Hawksworth. I'm a member of the developer experience team at Netlify, and I have the great honor of being your host for the next few hours as we talk about migrating to the modern web, and we get talking a little bit about Jamstack. So I'm going to be talking about the Jamstack Onramp, and I'm kind of loftily giving this the subtitle of why to go and how to get there. And I'm very mindful of the fact that we work in technology, we work in web development, and there's a whole lot of terminology out there. It changes all the time. There's always things being added to it. There's a lot of buzz being created from that. One might say sometimes there's a bit of hype, and it's difficult to make sure that we're not just consuming the hype, we're being mindful about it. So the last thing I want to do is introduce a new term into the conversation. And luckily the term Jamstack has been around for a little while now, so I feel like I'm not just adding to the noise. But it's not a term that's necessarily completely understood by everyone. I suspect that many of you are here because you're already aware of what the Jamstack is and how it works, what it is, what it does. Some might be a bit new to it, but either way, I think it's important that we're going to be able to articulate that to our peers and maybe to the people we're trying to convince that Jamstack is the way forward, and that can be part of our on-ramp. So let's just very quickly have a bit of a recap and just kind of touch base on what I think is a useful definition of this. So Jamstack, I like to think of it this way, a way of thinking about how to build for the web. The UI is compiled, the front end is decoupled, and data is pulled in as needed. And there's a key word there, that word decoupled. I suspect we'll be hearing that a few times throughout the day. That's such a critical attribute of Jamstack, decoupling the UI, the front end from the back end, and also the fact that the data is pulled in as needed, maybe in the client with JavaScript, maybe at build time, calling different APIs at build time, it's pulled in as needed and if needed as well. Yes, the term Jamstack has come from JavaScript, APIs and markup. That's where the jam in Jamstack comes from. And that naming was very deliberate. The JavaScript has really matured over the years and now has become like the runtime for the web in the browser. And so the fact that browsers have matured and we're able to do more with JavaScript now client side means that we can build more experiences. We can call in APIs from the client side. We can do so much more than we might have done before. And markup is still the thing that conveys the content in the first place. So yes, these were the building blocks really that kind of led to this name arriving in the first place. But I would stress, let's not get hung up on that. Let's not get hung up on the fact that these are the words that derive that acronym. We don't have to use all three. Really, Jamstack means so much more than what it stands for, that acronym. Again, I would call out this definition or this description maybe is a little bit more useful to lean on than explaining what J, A, and M stand for. So this notion of decoupling is really critical to this kind of thinking. Good, so that's all clear, but maybe it's not. It still seems a little bit, I don't know, virtual in our description. What really is Jamstack? Let's just dig a tiny bit more, because some of this context will help in talking about some other aspects that is kind of the on-ramp to Jamstack. So I like to kind of think back a little bit to how web development used to be so simple. Forgive me if I sound like a bit of an old fogey now talking like this, but it used to be that we would have an address for every resource that we wanted to request, and the browsers would ask for stuff and the servers would return the stuff, and that was lovely. And building things and deploying things to that environment also seemed really logical. We would deploy stuff, we'd put it somewhere, and that would be available on addresses, and that was great. That afforded us a very simple mental model of how we would be building and how we would be deploying sites through to the web. But of course, the world changed. We made things smarter. We made the experiences more sophisticated. We we expanded what users expected from their experiences, and we wanted to make things more sophisticated. So our models of building and of hosting and of serving things got more smarter, got more complex. So our deployment models got more complicated, our hosting infrastructure got more complicated. And if we kind of expand it out to, you know, a somewhat simplified view of what serving a request looks like, and I've shown these kind of diagrams before, but it bears repeating. I think, you know, in our traditional stack as it evolved, you know, an HTTP request would hit our infrastructure, and it maybe that it passed through like a load balancer, so it would find the correct one of multiple web servers that we had to have in order to deliver scale. Those web servers would be running the logic, running the building the views. That might be calling on databases or database servers, and so this request would be passing backward and forward, and we'd have code and content living and configuration living across these places. So, you know, building and deploying things to these environments became non-trivial. You know, it became a question of how every time we updated how our sites worked and the content that lived on them, we might need to update any or all of the parts of this infrastructure. So if we contrast that with the Jamstack model, where we're pre-rendering and pre-compiling our user interface and then placing that on a content delivery network so it's ready to be served as soon as it's requested, the model straight away appears far simpler, but we need to understand it more, of course, to recognize that its strengths and its weaknesses. But this is the model here. So the request hits the CDN, you get what you asked for, and you're done. That's the model we're trying to build on. Now, of course, we didn't just stop supporting rich experiences and data-rich, content-rich, and dynamic-feeling experiences. There is still complexity going on in the way that we populate our templates, and our build mechanics have become more sophisticated now. So we have these, you know, builds that combine content from APIs and our templates and other logic and mechanics, and we might be pulling those from different kind of content and decoupled code repositories and what have you. But critically, those pieces are now decoupled from the front end or from request time. We can do a lot of this work ahead of time and get that ready to roll so that we get things to the CDN so they're ready when the user requests them. Decoupling from request time from build time is one of the biggest considerations and principles of the Jamstack to understand and to protect, because we get so many benefits from it. And so I talk about that because I wanted to set context for this on-ramp. You know, how do we move from our traditional way of building sites and maybe the infrastructure we have around us at work or with our clients to a Jamstack model and a Jamstack architecture? Well, I want to recognize that our technology choices have impacts, right? The way that we choose to architect our sites, the tools that we use to build them with, have huge impacts on the performance, the functionality we can bring to bear, the effectiveness of the experiences that the users get, and the effectiveness of the projects themselves, and the workflows that we can realize to bring these things all to life. Of course, our technology choices have real impacts on that, which is why we all get so passionate about them. Also, making changes to our technologies has impacts as well. Of course, we've all invested in a particular way of working in a particular set of technologies already. So the idea of migrating to something different should rightly give us pause for thought. It has a big impact on the team skills we need, the efficiencies we can have on our projects, whether that's an improvement or otherwise. And we often think about the sunk cost as well. Often we've invested, or our clients have invested hugely in their infrastructure, their technologies, their software. So we shouldn't just dismiss that out of hand. We need to consider all of these things when we're thinking about making a migration. So over the next 15 minutes or so, I want to talk about some of the barriers to entry to the Jamstack that we'll need to consider. That'll lead us to talking about the benefits as well. And then I want to just lay the groundwork for a bit of planning your route. I want to seed the conversation you'll hear from Bhavna and others later in their talks, and just give you a very, very short glimpse of a way that we can start making that migration right away in just a matter of minutes. So we'll get to that along the way. But let's first talk about barriers. Let's talk about the different types of barriers there are to adopting Jamstack in the first place. And I think of them as falling into two camps, either technical or human. And I can imagine that the chat in a moment might ripple into people saying, well, yes, it could be animal, vegetable, or mineral, get to the point. But I do feel like these are the two camps that a lot of the barriers fall into. So let's talk about technical, first of all. How can we ensure that our architectures fulfill our requirements? And really this comes down, first of all, to understanding the architecture. And of course, that seems like stating the obvious, but it could not be more critical, because we feel like we've got an understanding of what Jamstack is, but we really need to get to grips with it and understand what the mechanics and what the workflows are that it enables, and the ways of building things that it unlocks. So I'm not going to dig into every aspect of that, but that is a core attribute that we need to get into. That is often water muddied by the trap of platform-driven requirements. This is something I've encountered many, many times, and it's locked me into a technology choice along the way, because particularly for those maybe working in the enterprise or for large brands or large agencies, often a popular platform or framework brings its own list of features and capabilities, and that is something that people invest in and buy into. So there are occasions where this introduces technology bias. If you invest in or are shopping for the best-in-class enterprise-grade bit of software, there's a very long list of features, and that can often end up being reverse engineered into the requirements of the sites we're building. So do you really need each of those features is something I would invite everyone to challenge on every project as they're choosing their technology stack. Not only does your technology support it, but can you support it? So for instance, if we're looking at a platform that gives us very granular personalized content delivery for each of your users, wonderful. That sounds like it could give us a really effective conversion rate. But can we support that in terms of the content that we're creating, in terms of understanding the personas of the different users and our audiences? Although there might be an item on a list of features, they don't come for free, and implementing them often has huge impact. So avoiding this trap, I think, is key, and really understanding the requirements in the first place is critical. So that would lead me to this point. It's so important that we interrogate our requirements on all of our projects before we choose the stack and before we identify how we want to proceed. I made myself initially unpopular and then popular on projects in the past by really challenging the requirements that were put to me, because that way we get to qualify the requirements, understanding why we might want to build something, but so we can then decide how we should build it in the first place. So that's particularly key. Also, this kind of leads us, kind of blends the line a little bit into kind of these human factors and these human kind of barriers to choosing Jamstack, is that we need to reassure stakeholders, clients, and decision makers that this is the appropriate option, if indeed it is. And that can be something that maybe many people here are either on the edge, is this the right thing for our projects? Or yes, I've identified this is the right thing, if only I could articulate that to my stakeholders so they could be convinced as well and we can move forward. So I think this is a key part of friction sometimes in adopting Jamstack, where if we can understand this, so we can get onto that on-ramp a bit faster. So really finding ways to fight this or to combat, to overcome this, often come from articulating the benefits. The benefits to the end user, the benefits to the project as a whole, and ultimately the benefits to the business when it comes to things like return on investment, time to market, and lots of those other bits and pieces. So let's get into talking about some of those benefits. We're kind of at that point. So I mentioned at the very beginning that part of this Jamstack kind of definition, if you like, is in the fact that we're pre-compiling or pre-generating the front end, the UI, and as a result, we're decoupling the UI from the request time, and as a result, the logic of the infrastructure that needs to service. So this leads us to something which I think is a huge attribute of the Jamstack, and that is that front-end code is no longer limited to being product of a back-end system. There's a lot to digest in that sentence, but really thinking of the fact that for so many years, the front end has been the output of a more complex back-end system that does many, many things. By rolling things into a bit of a monolith, which has been popular in the past, you've needed to be an expert in that back-end system in order to be able to generate the front end, which is an entirely different discipline. So by decoupling these things and meaning that the front end code can become a complete craft in and of itself, which we all know it is, and it has a huge impact on effectiveness of what we build. By decoupling these things, we're unshackling front end developers to really express their craft. So quality and efficiency goes through the roof. But so maybe some more tangible and more easily recounted benefits. Let's talk about 4 others. We'll talk about security, how susceptible our infrastructure is to attack; scale, how well we can handle high volumes of content; speed, how quickly we can deliver content to the users; and the 4th S, experience, how effectively and confidently we can build, release, and maintain sites. And yes, I know experience isn't a word, but I needed that 4th S. I may be talking about developer experience there. Maybe I'd frame that as workflow. But yeah, how effectively and confidently we can build, release, and maintain sites, all in furthering a better user experience and a better result. So let's just talk quickly about each of those. So first of all, security. And I'd invite you, when thinking about whether Jamstack is right for you or if it's a good solution for what you need and how you articulate that to stakeholders so that you can get buy-in to use it, is to question which parts of our infrastructure execute code on the different stacks. If I jump over to this diagram once again, and with this comparison of the traditional stack to the Jamstack, where is code being executed? Well, realistically, at each of these stages in the traditional stack, we might be making queries to there, we might be executing code, applying logic, things execute there. We need to lock all of those things down and make sure that they're as secure as possible. You compare that to the Jamstack, where our assets are pre-generated and put on the CDN. Well, there are fewer servers or fewer lines and boxes straight away here in this model, but also just the profile of what they are doing in those places is quite different. So our security exposure is very, very different in these 2 places. We might talk about the APIs and the services that go along with these assets, but let's refer back to that later to talk about whose responsibility those things are. Let's talk about scale for a second. When we're thinking about how we scale up, traditional stacks tend to add infrastructure in order to scale. If we want to serve more and more users and more requests, that's traditionally what we do. So again, back to our diagram, how would we scale here and how would we plan to accommodate scale? We'd add more servers and more infrastructure. We'd be adding maybe to the load balancers, more web servers, more database servers. This is all more for us to provision, to maintain, to pay for, and to deploy to and keep in check. So although that's how things are scaling in the traditional stack, Jamstack is built for scale by default because we're serving things from a CDN and their job is to serve things at scale. So we kind of get that out of the gate. Similarly for speed. Speed, in traditional stacks, we add static layers in order to improve performance. I'm talking about caching there. That's often what happens in a traditional stack. Luckily, caching is one of the easiest things in all of computer science. Said nobody ever. Caching is incredibly hard to do right. And that's why an entire industry has come around to support that. And if we think again of our diagram here, where we've added additional infrastructure, where do we do caching? How do we do caching? We might be adding layers of caching at our web servers for some, but not all of the requests. We might be caching some popular queries to our databases, not all of them, but some of them. Some still need to be dynamic, perhaps, we think. We might be adding caching even at the load balancers layers. Across the board, there may be layers of caching, and we need to manage the logic of what's cached, what's not cached, when to expire that cache, and everything that goes along with it that has built up an industry of experts who earn big money for it. On the Jamstack, the CDN is a big cache, effectively. So by normalizing our model to hosting and by putting things into a CDN, it means that we can normalize our approach to caching and create some very sensible defaults that will perform very well. We can override those defaults, of course, but ultimately we're building in caching as a first-class citizen of this experience, which means that our developer experience in creating these things and deploying these things is joyous. It's far simpler than what it used to be because, again, we're building things and putting them into a CDN rather than, and I couldn't illustrate this diagram with enough arrows, deploying things to all of these other bits of infrastructure and understanding what changes when and what might be cached and what might be not. So we reduce friction. We're moving more to this kind of simple mental model, even if there are moving parts. It gives us access to this mental model, which is far easier to reason about. I'd also call out that, this is all supported by an ecosystem. We've got now, this is a bit of an old slide now from Stacia Myers at Redpoint, but this has been a flourishing ecosystem of tools and services that we can build on and call on in order to enrich the things that we're building and hand off the responsibility for dedicated domain experts for some things, such as identity and authentication or e-commerce. We can consume those as a service over APIs now, allowing us to maintain this idea of our mental model of the things that we build can remain simple, and we can be calling out to other services and we need them. It allows us all to keep those kind of specialisms and have dedicated workflows along the way. With an eye on time, I'm going to keep moving along because I want to talk now about the fear of moving a monolith. We maybe built up a huge set of infrastructure, and the idea of moving it is difficult. So we need to understand how we might plan our route. So I'll call out a couple of things that we'll hear people elaborate on further down the road today. But I want to talk just for a moment about one of the key things we need to do is understand the project fit. If we're taking our first steps into a Jamstack architecture, we can look at the different projects that we might be working on and identifying which are the simplest ones and maybe the easiest win to prove out the workflow and prove out the model before moving on to more challenging ones perhaps later. So identifying a project fit is key. And Bhavna will talk a little bit about that, and there'll be more content about that throughout the day. We might be introducing new sites, or we might be using, we might be migrating existing sites. So we need to kind of think about those two as slightly different projects that we might undertake. And it's important that we choose our tooling to suit as well. We've got a lot of functional requirements to satisfy, but we also have team preferences and team skills that exist along the way. So this is another important thing to consider when thinking about how you move to the Jamstack. There's a whole host of tools that we could use and technologies we can use. If you think back to that that slide from Redpoint, there are lots of tools out there, and we can choose from them and still be in the Jamstack world. And then we should be considering our abstractions. What can we further decouple? Can we take our content and decouple that so it lives in a headless or decoupled content management system? Can we do the same thing for our assets and our e-commerce? What aspects can we abstract away? And then how do we start prototyping sites and not only prototyping sites, but prototyping the processes so we can experience them for the first time? Do we choose the most mission critical first big project, or are there smaller things that we can experiment with along the way? Pick your poison is the wrong expression, I think, to use, but you can choose what suits you the best for that. But the key thing to remember, and you'll hear this, I think, a couple of times throughout the day, is that a big bang is not required. We can migrate sites, existing sites and from existing infrastructure slowly and carefully and quite gradually. So I'll dip in with just about enough time to do this, a 3-minute thought starter, and hopefully that 3 minutes will include these slides as well, about a model of how we might migrate from a legacy infrastructure where we've got a client making requests to our legacy infrastructure and getting its HTTP responses back. How might we move across by starting to introduce something in the middle? So instead, now adding Netlify in the middle to service all of these requests, and anything that it can't service from a Jamstack site, it passes along to the existing infrastructure. And it does that by having some redirects logic. We have a redirects API that lives at the edge of our CDN that can route traffic. And I'm going to show you that in just a second. Over time, as more content can be satisfied by Netlify, we can start to expand that and pass fewer things through to the existing legacy infrastructure, which has remained unchanged and in place, expanding that over time until potentially we replace it entirely, or maybe we keep some of it around to service particular API requests. So that model I'm going to demonstrate now. So you'll see that here in this video, where I'm looking at a site. This is Nike.com. It's an e-commerce site that that you may have seen before, and it will be very, very familiar. What if we were to migrate Nike? We're not going to be, but I'll use this as a demonstration to a different bit of infrastructure. So I'm going to create an entirely new site. You can see in this is a folder which is completely empty. There is no site at all at the moment. So I'm going to create a redirects file, first of all, which is how we configure Netlify CDN to shape traffic around. And in that redirects file, I'm going to put one line of configuration. I'm going to say that every request that comes in to the site, wherever whatever path it's on, we are going to service that from nike.com/splat. So the splat is the keyword for whatever request came in. And we'll return that with a 200 request. So in other words, we are proxying that behind the scenes to nike.com or an existing infrastructure if we don't have a response. Let's add an index file as well. So we do have some pages to actually serve. I've gone off and I've just copied the source of the good old view source from nike.com. And let's change one bit of this. So rather than the best of Air Max, let's say the best of Jamstacks. That seems fine. Another spelling of Jamstacks won't add any more confusion. So now we've added this as a page to our site. Let's create a site now. We don't have a site yet. So I'll use NTL init to create a new site. I'll just deploy this manually rather than through Git. I'll add it to my team. And once I've done that, I can actually run a deploy and push this to the CDN. So the file, the index file, and that configuration will both go to the CDN. And then we'll be able to take a look at the URL and see what that looks like. So here we go. Here's our new site. And well, the assets look all the same because everything that we couldn't satisfy from Netlify are being passed through, but we are serving the best of Jamstacks. So this index file is being served from our site. The rest is being passed through to the existing infrastructure. And it's because of this redirects file and the way that the CDN at Netlify works. So it's 2.5 minutes of demonstration of that, but that kind of shows how, a big bang is not required. We can start to gradually migrate one URL at a time, should we wish, across to the Jamstack. So let's sum up quickly. I'm a little over time. The Jamstack provides workflows and confidence I wish I'd had before I started using it, not just for the result that it gives, the experience it gives, but also for things like the planning and the confidence in the planning in the first place, and for planning how the staff would be working on it, or who are the developers and what skills do they need. Planning for that is much easier than perhaps with exotic infrastructure. Also for handing over to clients, if I was an agency handing things along to other clients, that's something that has become far easier. And again, I think that's a real benefit that we can talk about when working on this Onramp into the Jamstack. My last note on understanding the architecture, I mentioned this at the beginning and it seems kind of flippant and it seems kind of key, but understanding the architecture is critical. We've got so many workflows and powerful things now that it works like magic, and that's joyous for developers. The real power comes in when it works like magic, except we can understand it. And that's why retaining this mental model, I think, is super, super important. Okay, I'm 2 minutes over time. I apologize. It's important that we talk more. So I think this is the perfect opportunity for us to launch into our next talk of the day.